welcome to the 7th video in the series, where we'll be looking at the world on the move through transportation. Interestingly, transportation is the ultimate means to an end. It only exists because something or someone has to be moved from one place to another. For people, most of these journeys are return journeys like commuting to work or school or even going on vacation. But for materials and goods, they tend to be just one way. Either way, transportation is a necessary part of our everyday lives. Transportation helps keep our modern world turning. On a macro scale, transportation networks are complex and intricate, roughly analogous to the human circulatory system. Just as the circulatory system serves all parts of the human body, transportation networks physically connect neighborhoods, cities, countries and continents, moving people and things. The lifeblood of both society and the economy. So how do we define transportation? And why do we need to go anywhere or move anything in the first place? And the answer is simple. To fulfill our needs and many of our wants. Without transportation systems, there'd be no commuting to work or school, no long-distance vacations, no driving to shopping malls, and none of the vast array of products and services we enjoy every day. But just how complex are these networks? Let's go back to the example of coffee that we talked of in the previous video. 70% of Canadians drink Tim Hortons coffee, making it the most purchased brand in the country. It's often called Canada's coffee. But the reality is much more global. Coffee beans used by Tim Hortons are cultivated in several countries: Colombia, Guatemala, Brazil, Kenya, and even El Salvador. Now, once these beans have been harvested, they travel by road or rail to port and are shipped to Canada. There they're transferred to the land and then sent again by road or rail to the main processing centre in Ancaster. After processing, the coffee beans are then transported to one of 5 different regional distribution centres located in Guelph and Kingston in Ontario, Deba in Nova Scotia, Calgary in Alberta, and Langley in British Columbia. From these centres, they're distributed to the over 3,600 Tim Hortons restaurants in Canada and the US. And finally, into your double-double. And all said and done, a coffee bean in Ottawa, for example, can easily have travelled more than 8,200 kilometres by road, rail and sea, just to get into your cup. That's probably thousands of times further than you travelled to buy your coffee in the first place. And remember too, that figure doesn't include the travelling done by the cup, the lid, or the cream and the sugar, or because you want a familiar drink. When you consider the vast amount of consumer goods available and being sold, there really is a staggering amount of stuff being transported all over the world. Lumber, metals, oil, all kinds of products, and all manner of foodstuffs we rely on to be transported and readily available. Now, given that the overwhelming majority, some 95% of transportation energy comes from fossil fuels, this has a very real and very large environmental impact. Canada's national greenhouse gas emissions are equivalent to over 700 million tonnes of carbon dioxide every year, and transportation emissions account for well over 1/4 of the country's total. Oil and transportation are becoming more costly and impactful every day. The movement of goods and services represents only half of the transportation picture. We, the people, are the other half. The most common reason to travel on a regular basis is for work. In Canada, about 93% of people with jobs commute to work daily. Of these, almost 80% use a car or a truck. About 12% use public transit, and the rest, less than 1 in 10, either walk or bike. So let's examine this mix a little more closely. Take, for example, 4 different commuters in an average-sized city. Debbie lives downtown, leads an active lifestyle, and walks to and from her job, about 2 kilometres each way. Wesley is a mature professional who cycles about 7 kilometres to his job. Erin is a public servant who takes the bus to get to her job, and that's near the downtown core, a distance of about 8 kilometres. And finally, Bob, who drives across the city every day, travelling about 22 kilometres. It'll take about the same time to get to work. Canadian average, about 25 minutes. But the daily cost to each person and to the environment is very different. Debbie who walks to work, and Wesley, who cycles, spend the least and are likely the healthiest. Erin, the bus rider, pays a few dollars a day, and Bob, the driver, pays the most, around $20 per day with all costs considered. That's almost 5 times as much as the other 3 commuters combined. The factors affecting personal choice of transportation are largely determined by distance, time, affordability, and of course the weather, which explains why fewer people walk or cycle to work in January as opposed to July. So, interestingly, when we think of buying or renting a house, we really should factor in the costs of commuting. But few of us do. All of these factors feed into the big question of personal convenience. Deciding how we get to work often requires us to make trade-offs involving time and money. For example, many motorists pay a great deal for the convenience of not waiting at a bus stop and not being exposed to bad weather. The environmental impacts of these choices, such as atmospheric pollution, are considerable. Cars and light trucks are by far the largest greenhouse gas emitters in the transportation sector. And despite Canadians representing less than half of 1% of the global population, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions from fuel combustion alone make up 2% of the world's total. On top of that, we should remind ourselves of the health benefits that we gain from walking or cycling to work, especially given that 60% of Canadians are now considered obese or overweight. We constantly hear how physical activity can help, and getting fit on the way to work can be cheaper, easier, and less time-consuming than going to the gym. Remember, we're the only animals who use fitness equipment, unless you count the wheels in hamster cages. So, why don't we walk or cycle more? And why do we expect to get all our goods and services so conveniently after driving to box store shopping malls? See, much of North America was developed in an era of cheap energy, mostly oil. There seemed to be endless land, and of course we all wanted to own our piece of it. The picturesque vision of suburbia with massive grass lawns was inevitable. As a consequence, our daily travel and car ownership are still increasing. There are now almost twice as many vehicles per household than 50 years ago. The average Canadian, that's the Canadian family, now spends as much on transportation as it does on food and clothing combined. In Europe, the early settlements were more dependent in their evolution on how far a person could travel in one day, by horse or on foot. Today, all cities around the world have become dense with automobiles and the pollution that comes with them. But the understanding that roads actually breed cars was realized long ago. In many European countries, there have been policies against the building of new roads to solve traffic problems for many years. Instead, the roads may be narrowed and designated differently, with transit stations becoming hubs for all manner of human activity. And at the same time, more bicycle-friendly. Many think of European cities, Copenhagen for example, as being bicycle-friendly. But here in North America, Portland, Oregon is also held up as a model. And even New York City has made great strides in cycle and pedestrian friendliness. And if New York can do it, so can every other city. So, for environmental responsibility and human health, it can be a big disadvantage living in a city that was developed during a time of cheap fuel. Urban and suburban sprawl have resulted, and Toronto now has some of the longest average commute times in the world. In large, sprawling cities, we need better public transport, and we need to eliminate any stigma attached to using it. In most European cities, there's little stigma in taking transit. A large number of people commute using a mixture of walking, cycling and public transportation. It works, even in the harshest of winters. Now, back to the other half of the problem. For the movement and goods and services, a major future change will probably be cost. The cost of oil is rising, and the wage differences across the planet may narrow in the not too distant future. Could these economic shifts make local manufacture more viable in North America? We also need to factor in consideration of the environmental impacts of oil spills and air pollution. The past 2 centuries have seen transportation networks grow to cover the globe, easily, cheaply, and at previously unfathomable speeds. And with this, we've developed a globalized economy. Transportation connects the world, but we need to be mindful of the impacts of our choices and our lifestyles. We need to find a healthy, sustainable balance between our desire to move around and the need to minimize our environmental impact on the planet. We'll see you next time when the topic will be packaging.